Take a standard deck and look at what you are holding. 52 cards, 4 suits, 13 ranks, 3 court cards per suit. 2 colors, a joker, or 2 that nobody quite knows what to do with. Almost every element of that arrangement is a historical accident, and several of them are the result of a tax dispute, a printing shortcut, and a series of translation errors as the objects moved between cultures that could not read each other's symbols. The King of Hearts appears to be stabbing himself in the head because an engraver copied a copy of a copy until the axe he was originally holding disappeared. The suits you use depend entirely on which European country's printing industry happened to dominate the export market. None of this was designed. It accumulated. Let's dig into this properly because the trail runs back considerably further than Europe, and the early stretch of it is frustratingly thin. The origin is China, and it is tied directly to the invention of paper and printing. Once you have cheap paper and a way to reproduce images on it, small portable printed objects become possible, and China had both centuries before anywhere else. References to something that may be card games appear in Chinese sources from around the 9th century, during the Tang dynasty, including an account of a princess playing what has been described as a leaf game. That interpretation is disputed. The term involved could refer to a game played with cards or to something else entirely, possibly a board game with paper components, or a drinking game using printed sheets. What is much firmer is that by the time of later dynasties, printed card games clearly existed in China, and some were closely related to paper money, with cards depicting denominations of currency and games structured around them. Chinese money-suited cards are the earliest reasonably well-documented card system, and several traditional East Asian card and tile games, including the ancestry of mahjong, connect to that tradition. Let's talk about how they reached Europe too, because this represents a gap in the record that has never been fully closed. Playing cards appear in European sources abruptly and almost simultaneously across a wide area in the second half of the 14th century. City records from various parts of Italy, Spain, Switzerland, and Germany begin mentioning them within a few decades of each other, frequently in the form of prohibitions, bans on card playing, restrictions on gambling, sermons denouncing the practice. That is a common pattern in the history of leisure. The earliest written evidence of a popular activity is often somebody trying to stop it. The most widely accepted route is through the Islamic world, and specifically through Mamluk Egypt. A near-complete deck of Mamluk cards survives in a museum in Istanbul, and its structure is strikingly familiar. It has 4 suits: cups, coins, swords, and polo sticks, with 10 numbered cards per suit plus 3 court cards, making 52 cards in total. That is essentially the modern deck's architecture, arriving in Europe fully formed. The suits map onto the earliest European suits closely. Italian and Spanish decks use cups, coins, swords, and clubs or batons, and the batons are generally understood as a reinterpretation of polo sticks, since polo was unfamiliar in Europe and the objects were redrawn as something recognizable. This is the first of several translation errors that shaped the deck. The Mamluk cards also reveal something about the transmission. Islamic artistic tradition generally avoided figurative depiction of people in many contexts, and the Mamluk court cards accordingly show ornate abstract designs and inscriptions naming ranks rather than portraits. European makers working without that constraint converted those ranks into pictures of people, which is where the kings, knights, and knaves come from. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it explains a persistent oddity. European decks did not initially agree about how many court cards there should be or who they represented. Italian and Spanish decks kept a king, a knight on horseback, and a foot soldier. German decks dropped the king in some designs and used entirely different suits. French decks eventually settled on king, queen, and knave, introducing a queen where the Mamluk original had none. The queen in a modern deck is a European addition with no ancestor in the source. Material. Let's talk about how cards are actually made too, because this represents a manufacturing problem with some non-obvious requirements. A playing card has to satisfy several conditions at once, and they conflict. It must be completely opaque, since a card you can read from the back is worthless. It must be stiff enough to handle and flexible enough to bend without creasing permanently. It must slide against its neighbors smoothly enough to shuffle and deal without sticking. It must be identical to every other card in the deck to a tolerance fine enough that no card can be identified by feel or by looking at the edge of a stack, and it must survive thousands of handlings. Opacity is solved by construction rather than by thickness. Quality cards are made from 2 or 3 layers of paper laminated together with a dark adhesive core between them, usually black or gray, which blocks light completely. That is why a good card can be thin and still unreadable from behind, and why a card torn in half reveals a dark stripe through the middle. Handling is solved by finish. Cards are coated and then embossed with a microscopic texture, which reduces the contact area between adjacent cards and lets them slide freely instead of clinging. The specific pattern of that embossing is proprietary to manufacturers and is one of the main differences between a cheap deck and an expensive one, along with the paper stock and the precision of the cutting. Cutting precision matters more than it sounds. Cards are printed in large sheets and cut in stacks, and any drift in the cutting produces cards with subtly different dimensions or with the back design slightly off-center. That is a genuine problem in games where money is involved, since consistent off-centering can make specific cards identifiable from the back, and casino decks are manufactured to tighter tolerances and retired after remarkably short periods of use for exactly this reason. Let's talk about the suits themselves too, because this represents the clearest case of an accident becoming a global standard. Early European decks were expensive. Cards were hand-painted or printed from wood blocks and then colored by hand, and the Italian and Spanish suits, cups, coins, swords, batons, required detailed images repeated many times per deck. French card makers in the 15th century simplified drastically. They reduced the suit symbols to flat shapes that could be printed from simple stencils in solid color: hearts, tiles, clovers, and pike heads, which English speakers call hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades. 2 of those names are fossils of the older system. Spades derives from the Italian word for swords, and clubs is a direct translation of the baton suit, even though the French symbol drawn is a clover leaf rather than a stick. The advantage was manufacturing cost. A stenciled 2-color deck could be produced far faster and far cheaper than a hand-illuminated one, which meant French cards undercut everyone in the export market. That commercial advantage, rather than any design merit, is why the French suits became the international standard, and why regional systems survive today, mainly in the countries that resisted the export flood. German suited decks with acorns, leaves, hearts, and bells persist in parts of Central Europe, and Italian and Spanish regional decks remain in use for traditional games. Let's talk about the numbers too, because they are less fixed than they look. 52 is not a natural quantity. Regional decks across Europe vary considerably, with many traditional games using 32, 36, 40, or 48 cards, produced by removing ranks that particular games do not need. Spanish decks commonly omit certain numbers. The 40-card Italian deck is standard for several classic games. Tarot decks add an entire additional suit of trump cards plus a fool, producing 78, and it is worth correcting a very widespread misconception here. Tarot was invented as a card game, played competitively across Europe for centuries, and its use for divination is a later development dating to the 18th century and later. The trick-taking games played with tarot decks are still played in parts of Europe today. There is a persistent piece of folklore claiming that the deck encodes a calendar: 52 cards for the weeks, 4 suits for the seasons, 13 ranks for the lunar months, and the sum of the card values approximating the days in a year. It is a satisfying pattern, and there is no historical evidence that any of it was intended. The number 52 came from the Mamluk structure, which came from having 10 numbers and 3 courts across 4 suits, and the correspondences are coincidence dressed up after the fact. Let's talk about the court cards too, because this represents the strangest survival in the whole object. The specific figures on French suited court cards became standardized in Rouen and later in England, and at various points card makers assigned names to them: historical and biblical kings, famous knights, figures from romance. Those attributions were inconsistent between makers and were largely abandoned, though French decks retained named courts for considerably longer. What did survive was the imagery, and it survived through a long chain of copying. Card makers reproduced designs from existing decks rather than drawing fresh, and each generation of woodblocks introduced small errors that the next copyist faithfully reproduced. Over centuries, details degraded into shapes whose original meaning was lost. The King of Hearts is the famous case. He appears to hold a sword behind his own head, and comparison with earlier decks indicates the object was originally an axe held to one side, which lost its blade through successive copying. The one-eyed jacks and the profile views are similar fossils of earlier designs rather than deliberate symbolism. The double-headed court card, mirrored so it reads correctly from either direction, is a 19th century innovation, and a practical one. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Before it, a player had to turn cards the right way up, and doing so at the table signaled information to opponents. Corner indices, the small rank and suit markers that let you fan a hand and read it, are also 19th century, and they are arguably the single most significant improvement in the object's history since they made it possible to hold a large hand compactly in one hand. Let's talk about the ace too, because its status is a small piece of social history. In most early games, the ace was simply the lowest card. Its promotion to the highest rank in many games is frequently attributed to the period around the French Revolution, with the reversal of a card ranking below the courts to above them read as a deliberate symbolic gesture. That story is appealing, and the evidence for it is weak. High ace conventions appear in games before that period, and rankings varied by game regardless. Like the calendar theory, it is a story attached to the object afterwards. The Ace of Spades, though, has a documented and truly odd history. Playing cards were taxed in England from the 17th century onward, and the tax was administered by requiring an official stamp on one card in the deck. The Ace of Spades was the designated card, and it was printed with an elaborate official design incorporating the maker's name and evidence that duty had been paid. That is why the Ace of Spades in traditional English pattern decks is far more ornate than any other card. Forging it was treated as a serious offense, since it amounted to tax fraud, and there are recorded prosecutions. The tax was eventually abolished and the decorative ace remained, an ornamental leftover of a revenue system nobody remembers. Let's talk about the Joker too, because it is the only card in the modern deck with an entirely American origin. It appears in the mid-19th century United States, introduced as a high trump for the game of euchre, where a card serving that function was needed. The name appears to derive from a variant name for the game itself. It spread into other games as a wild card, and into decks generally as a spare, and it has no connection to the Fool of the Tarot deck despite the frequent assumption that it does. That resemblance is coincidental, since the two arose in different centuries in different places for different purposes. Let's talk about what cards did for mathematics too, because this represents a contribution that is easy to overlook and remarkably large. Probability theory has a reasonably specific origin, and it lies in gambling problems. Correspondence between Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat in the mid-17th century, prompted by questions from a gambler about how to divide stakes fairly when a game is interrupted, is generally treated as the foundation of the field. The problems being solved were card and dice problems posed by people who wanted to know how to bet. That origin shaped what followed. Working out the chance of drawing a particular hand requires counting combinations systematically, which is why combinatorics developed alongside. Questions about expected value, about how likely a run of results is, and about how confident one can be after a limited number of observations all have direct gambling ancestors. The mathematics that now underpins insurance, statistical inference, quality control, and risk assessment across every industry began with people arguing about card games. There is a specific quantity worth appreciating here. The number of distinct orderings of a 52-card deck is 52 factorial, which is a number with 68 digits. It is large enough that a thoroughly shuffled deck has, with overwhelming probability, never been in that exact order before in the history of the object. Every properly shuffled deck is effectively a new arrangement, permanently. Shuffling itself has been studied mathematically with surprisingly practical results. Analysis of the ordinary riffle shuffle found that the deck approaches randomness fairly abruptly rather than gradually, and that roughly 7 riffles are needed to reach a well-mixed state, with fewer leaving detectable structure. That finding had direct consequences for casino procedure and is one of the more accessible results in modern probability, since anyone can test the underlying claim at a table. Let's talk about the objections too, because cards were controversial for most of their history and the reasons are worth understanding. The prohibitions that provide our earliest European evidence were mostly aimed at gambling, and the concerns were practical as much as moral: money lost, work neglected, disputes, and violence arising from games. Religious authorities in various traditions condemned card playing at various times, with the objections generally centering on gambling, on idleness, and on the use of chance devices. Cards also carried a class dimension. Early decks were luxury objects owned by the wealthy, and the surviving hand-painted 15th century decks are extraordinary works of illumination. Printing inverted that within a couple of generations, making cards one of the earliest truly mass-produced consumer goods and putting them into the hands of soldiers, sailors, laborers, and anyone else with a few coins. That accessibility is precisely what alarmed authorities. And it is also why cards spread across the world so comprehensively. They are cheap, portable, durable enough, and support an effectively unlimited number of different games with no additional equipment. Let's talk about where cards traveled to, because this represents a spread that outpaced almost every other object of its kind. European decks moved with traders, soldiers, sailors, and colonial administrations, and they reached essentially everywhere. What happened on arrival varied, and the results are frequently strange. Japan received Portuguese cards in the 16th century, and the Portuguese word for card entered Japanese as karuta. Cards were subsequently banned repeatedly during periods of restriction on foreign influence and on gambling. And the response was a series of increasingly abstracted designs that evaded the prohibitions by no longer resembling the banned object. That process produced Hanafuda, a deck of small cards illustrated with flowers and seasonal imagery in 12 suits corresponding to months, which bears almost no visual relationship to its European ancestor while descending directly from it. A company founded in Kyoto in the late 19th century to manufacture Hanafuda eventually diversified into other games and became Nintendo. India developed Ganjifa, circular hand-painted cards used in various regional traditions, with deck sizes and suit systems differing considerably from European models and with elaborate painted decks produced as luxury objects. In parts of Southeast Asia, local traditions absorbed and modified imported systems. Chinese money-suited cards continued in their own line of development entirely separate from the European branch that had descended from them centuries earlier. The pattern across all of these is worth naming. The deck was never adopted unchanged. Each culture that received it kept the underlying structure, a set of tokens with rank and suit, shuffled and dealt, and rebuilt the surface entirely, replacing symbols that meant nothing locally with ones that did. That is exactly what Europeans had done to the Mamluk deck, and what the Mamluks had presumably done to whatever reached them. Let's talk about cheating too, because this represents an arms race that has shaped the object as much as any game did. Where money is on a table, people have attempted to influence the outcome, and the methods developed are ingenious enough that entire professions exist to counter them. Marking is the oldest approach. A card identifiable from the back defeats the entire premise, and marks have been applied by scratching, by pricking with a pin so the mark can be felt, by shading or blocking small elements of the back pattern, and by altering the surface finish so light reflects differently. Intricate repeating back designs, which look purely decorative, are partly a countermeasure. A busy symmetrical pattern makes a small alteration far harder to spot than a plain surface would, while also making the card unreadable if it is slightly misprinted. Later methods used substances visible only through tinted lenses, which produced the corresponding countermeasure of checking decks under different lighting. Manipulation is the other branch. Dealing from the bottom of the deck, dealing the second card while appearing to deal the top one, controlling a card's position through a false shuffle that looks thorough and changes nothing, and switching cards in or out of play are all documented techniques with long histories and substantial literature. The skill involved is real, and some of the people who developed it published detailed accounts that became foundational texts for stage magicians, which is why card magic and card cheating share so much technique and vocabulary. The countermeasures shaped modern gambling operations directly. Casinos deal from shoes rather than from the hand, use cut cards, retire decks after short periods, mark decks with their own printing so a substituted card can be identified, and monitor tables continuously. Automatic shuffling machines were introduced partly to eliminate dealer-controlled shuffles altogether. Each of these exists because a specific method of cheating worked well enough to be worth engineering against. Let's talk about what makes the object so durable too, because this represents the underlying reason it has survived essentially unchanged for 6 centuries. A deck of cards is a randomization device combined with a set of distinguishable tokens carrying two independent attributes: rank and suit, which can be ordered, matched, grouped, and compared. That structure supports an enormous range of game mechanics: trick-taking, matching, shedding, accumulating, betting, patience games played alone, and games of pure memory. Very few objects support that breadth. A chess set plays chess. A football supports a family of related games. A deck of cards supports thousands of distinct games across every continent, and it does so at negligible cost. When a technology can be repurposed that widely, there is very little pressure to replace it, which is why the deck in your drawer is structurally the same object a Mamluk courtier was holding 700 years ago. Let's talk about playing alone too, because this represents a use of the deck that arrived late and became enormously significant. Card games are social by default. Nearly every game described so far requires opponents. Patience games, called solitaire in North America, are played by one person against the arrangement of the deck itself, and they appear in the written record surprisingly late, with the earliest clear references dating to the late 18th century in Northern Europe. Why they took 400 years to appear is not entirely clear. One suggestion is that the concept required a shift in how solitary leisure was regarded, since spending time alone with a diversion was viewed differently in earlier periods. Another points to the practical matter that patience games generally need a large flat surface and good light, both of which were less available before. Whatever the reason, the form spread quickly once it existed, and collections of patience games were published through the 19th century in considerable numbers. The significance became clearer much later. When personal computers arrived with graphical interfaces, a version of Klondike Patience was included. With an early release of Windows, and the stated purpose was partly instructional, teaching users the drag-and-drop mouse operations that the new interface required, using something they would actually want to do repeatedly. It became one of the most used pieces of software in history by a considerable margin, played by enormous numbers of people who never played anything else on a computer. That is a fitting endpoint for the object's trajectory. A deck that began as printed paper in China passed through the Islamic world into Europe, was reshaped by tax law and cost-cutting and copying errors, and ended up as the training exercise that taught a generation how to use a mouse. Let's talk about the court figures having names too, because this represents a small mystery that has generated a great deal of confident nonsense. French decks historically carried names printed on the court cards, and the assignments were reasonably stable in the Paris pattern. Kings drawn from biblical, classical, and legendary figures, queens likewise, and knaves given the names of knights from romance and history. What has never been established is why those particular figures. Various explanations have been proposed over the centuries, generally involving elaborate symbolic schemes in which each king represents a great empire and the whole deck encodes a theory of history. These readings are constructed backwards from the names rather than from any evidence about the intentions of the card makers who assigned them, and different writers have produced entirely incompatible versions of the same scheme, which is usually a reliable indication that the pattern is being imposed rather than discovered. The English pattern deck, which is the one most of the world uses, dropped the names entirely, which is why the figures on a standard deck today are anonymous. The frequently repeated claim that the King of Hearts specifically represents a particular historical emperor, or that the suits map onto medieval social classes, clergy, nobility, merchants, peasantry, belongs to the same family of retrospective interpretation. The social class reading is at least plausible in structure and has no documentary support from the period when the suits were designed. This is worth flagging because the deck attracts this kind of storytelling more than almost any other everyday object. Its symmetry, its numbers, and its stylized imagery all invite the search for hidden meaning, and centuries of writers have obliged. The actual history is messier and, to my mind, considerably better, a chain of practical decisions made by people trying to cut printing costs, satisfy tax inspectors, and copy a design they only partly understood. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. Playing cards originate in China, dependent on paper and printing, with reasonably clear evidence from the later medieval period, and disputed hints from the 9th century. They reached Europe in the 14th century, most likely through Mamluk Egypt, and the surviving Mamluk deck already had 4 suits, 10 numbers, 3 courts, and 52 cards, the modern structure arriving intact. Europeans then reinterpreted what they received. Polo sticks became batons because polo was unfamiliar. Abstract rank inscriptions became pictures of people, and a queen was invented that the original never had. French makers replaced detailed suit images with flat stencil shapes to cut costs, and that manufacturing advantage carried their suits around the world while the older names survived attached to the wrong pictures. A tax stamp produced the ornate ace of spades. Copying errors produced the king of hearts vanished axe. Corner indices and double-headed courts arrived in the 19th century, and an American euchre player added the joker, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. Nobody designed the deck of cards. It is a 700-year accumulation of misunderstandings, cost-cutting, tax compliance, and copying mistakes, and the result works so well that in 6 centuries of trying, nobody has managed to improve on it.